Welcome to the Programming Lions podcast today. We have a very special guest all the way from down under. Alexei joins us, and he's an Aussie teen embracing unique outlooks on communism, having family going all the way back to Soviet Russia. He's very knowledgeable of history and why he believes the world needs to shift. Let's get into it.
Alexei, welcome to the podcast. We're excited to have you on. You come all the way from Australia. So maybe to get things started, could you tell us a little bit more about yourself, where you live, what you're into?
Yeah, sure thing. Well, I'm 16, turned 16 a few months ago. I live in Victoria, which is a state in Australia. We have states like you do, but we have 6 of them. It's at the very south, so it gets reasonably cold in here. Not like what you expect Australia to be. With my interests, they're quite varied, but I like natural science as well as politics. I like particularly electrical engineering and computer software. I've done like a few coding projects in my life for sport. I play volleyball and I also go to the gym. I know you guys do CrossFit, isn't it?
Yep.
Quite regularly, so we might have common ground there. I guess for a while I've been very interested in history, sort of as a bonus to my political stuff. So
Okay.
I'll say those are my interests.
All right. Very cool.
Nice, yeah.
What's
So-
it like living in Australia?
Yeah.
Pretty similar to the USA, actually. I mean, although I've never been there, but I can imagine. Except, well, right now it's spring for us.
Mhm.
So, like, Christmas for us is in the middle of summer. It's very hot during it.
Alexei is
Yeah.
kind of a Russian name. So
Yeah.
what's your background?
Well, both my parents were born in Latvia, which I'm not sure if you know the country or not, but it's
Mhm.
very small, around 2 million people, borders Russia. But both of them, so I have Latvian heritage, but my
Mhm.
grandparents, out of the 4, which I have, 3 of them were born in Russia. The other one was born in Poland. So it's sort of all spread out, and because it was the same country for a while, there's lots of movement within the country. But now, so I'm sort of from everywhere around there, but Latvia is where my parents were born, but I can speak Russian, but I can't speak Latvian.
Okay.
They taught me Russian,
Oh.
not Latvian, because it's far more useful to know Russian.
Как дела?
So, хорошо. Как у тебя?
See? This is
Yeah.
great. Well,
Wow.
so you probably saw we visited Russia recently.
Yeah, I did. Yeah.
Yeah, we were there for a couple of weeks. And have you visited?
I actually haven't. I visited Latvia many times, but
Okay.
Russia, no, not yet. I plan to.
I've heard
but,
Latvia is a beautiful country.
yeah, it is. It's nice.
I imagine if you had grandparents that were
Mhm.
born in Russia and
Yeah.
Poland, they
Yeah.
must have told you some stories, or they must
Oh,
have
yeah,
told your
there's lots of
parents some stories.
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, yeah. If you want to get into that, we can.
Another kind of curiosity question is, how did you find us?
Pretty sure on Instagram Reels, there's actually a few people in my school that have seen you guys. Like, I tell them that I'm going to do a podcast interview, and they're like, "Yeah, we've heard of them. I've seen them like on Instagram Reels." So you've
Oh, wow.
Nice.
like whether it's your account directly or like other accounts, stitching or whatever, but
Mhm.
they've heard of you guys. So yeah.
Okay. Okay. All right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, we've had a few things go viral and interesting. So
Yeah.
we're
That's pretty
we're
cool.
getting seen in Australia, boys. That's good.
Yeah.
think.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All
Depends
over
on
the
what their
world.
opinion of us is.
Hopefully
Nonetheless,
it's
nonetheless, we were always interested to talk to interesting people with different perspectives, and I think we'll kind of get into that today. So, without further ado, why don't we get into some of the questions we had queued up and go from there?
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah.
So, how did you first get into the realm of politics and how do you lean?
Yeah. So with politics, again, this is sort of segueing into family history. I was interested in history as a young age. Not sure why, just was. Thought it was cool, tanks and guns and all that. And my grandparents, were in the USSR during World War II, the biggest war on the planet in the history of the world. So I looked very heavily into that. And from there, I sort of skewed on looking at the Soviet Union in general and how it's viewed in our society and how it actually was, asking my parents and just looking on the internet. And from that sort of spread out, just into general politics. So it sort of began with an interest in history, which turns into like World War II and Cold War history sort of thing. How I lean, I think the Soviet Union is pretty badly represented in Western society. I think it was a lot more nuanced, and there's a lot of, you know, marble aspects. Whether it worked, some parts worked, some parts didn't, but people are very quick to just disregard all of it, especially due to the Red Scare, McCarthyism in the USA a while ago. But it's very misrepresented, I believe. I have the that's the flag of the Latvian Soviet Socialist Republic. So each republic had a flag.
Oh, really?
That's the flag of Latvian one, which is where my parents are born, and it serves as a bit of a patriotic symbol, but also of my ideology. So how I lean is that way, and
Mm.
I'm also quite negative to U.S. foreign policy over that time. I've had a look at what they did, and there's been lots of wars and regime change, which people often overlook and don't talk about, again, due to American propaganda during that time. So
Mm.
that's the way I lean.
Okay.
Huh.
And are you very interested in American politics because just of our presence in the world, or what's the
Yeah,
reason?
it's very important, like American politics, and a lot of Australian people understand that. Like,
Mhm.
we follow the American elections just as heavily as we follow our own. So, like, yeah, it's very important, and not even just from an interest, but even economically, like the tariffs and all that. They've been like key talking points. Like, I do economics at school, and we've talked about them extensively, even though we're meant to just talk about Australia because they affect us a lot. So
Sure.
it's America is important to us.
Yeah, right, right. And so if I was to sum up your kind of political ideology, maybe it's still forming a bit, you're young, but
Yeah,
it leans towards
the communism. So
let's say a sympathetic view of historical USSR and some of the things that happened, more of a communist type of
right.
governance structure. Is that
Yeah,
fair to say?
that's fair to
Now,
say.
I find because we've talked to some other communist
Mhm.
uh, ideology people on our channel, and
Yeah.
it's definitely interesting. But what we found is that there's vast differences between some communist ideologies. So, can you maybe tell us a little bit more about like where you are
Right.
in that
Yeah.
kind of
We're,
spectrum?
it's very true to say there's vast differences. I'd say we argue with ourselves much more than with anyone else.
Yeah, I hear this a lot,
But
but I'm not in
yeah,
any of these forums. But
yeah, yeah. Well, a few of the differences are some people support a violent revolution, other people
mm,
support a gradual reformist sort of way to power. The people which support the reformism might be called democratic socialists.
mhm,
Uh, I'm for it's sort of a bit of a mix and it's a bit more pragmatic. But I like to view history not as what we should do, but what happens and why it happens.
mhm,
And so when I view revolutions in history, I don't see them as like someone came up with the idea and said, yes, let's start a revolution, and then everyone died and they had a big war. No, I view it as there was deep contradictions in that society which caused misery, and those people were so downtrodden that they had to fight and start a revolution. And it's violent, but it's violent because of the uh, contradictions in that society.
mhm,
So when there are revolutions, it's a matter of whether the goal is admirable or not. If there's a fascist revolution, I would not support it because the goal is not admirable. So I wouldn't support violence to achieve a non-admirable goal. But
mhm.
if there is a socialist communist revolution which can produce real change, and that's the most pragmatic way to change, I believe that it may be warranting of support. Um,
Okay, so it's
which,
justified if the outcome
Mm.
is like kind of
yeah,
matches up
the
with
end
your
justifies the
worldview.
means, I suppose.
Okay,
So
okay.
that's the
We
revolution aspect. The other stuff
Oh.
I would say is pretty in line with like standard Marxism Leninism of the states. I do have a few like critiques of the Soviet Union. One
mhm,
is collectivization, which is a policy I'm not I'm 50-50 on it. And I'm trying
mhm,
to look into it more. On one hand, I've read a book recently which said that collectivization essentially just caused excess deaths because kulaks who were being collectivized, who were
mhm.
getting their farms taken off them, would directly sabotage their farms, like as a means of revolt. And in return, the Soviet government has to imprison or kill them, and then it just
Yeah,
gets worse and worse, and it caused a
yeah.
fair few deaths. But I read another study about a year ago, and it was comparing Poland, communist Poland, which didn't have collectivization, and communist Bulgaria, which did. And the communist Bulgaria had much better farming productivity. So it's a bit of a topic I'm trying to look into. And then the other critique I probably have is their democracy. I've recently read very interesting stuff advocating for some levels of sortition. You know, like how juries are picked just by random selection for some government positions. I believe that some require some level of skill, so you can't just pick it randomly. But we should have randomly selected committees because that represents the actual population more. What they found is that when you have elections, the best people in society are chosen, which generally ends up being the upper class, which is why we have lots of rich politicians, but not many actual working class common people in power. So the Soviet Union also suffered from that. They had like this fringe minority of politicians who had not extreme inequality with the rest of society. They earned about 5 times more, which is still very, very equal compared to capitalist society standards, but there was still inequality and there was a divide over that. So that's the other critique.
Yeah, I think that's a fair critique of almost all
Yeah.
political positions, even around the world. I've often, like, we talked about this at home, where wouldn't it be great if we hired our politicians kind of like American Idol? Like, they had to go and, sort of like you could apply, and then the people actually chose them based on their talent, their moral hygiene, and all of that, versus like who gets the most funding.
Yeah, because funding determines a lot of elections in it.
Yeah. And of course, something that I think, like, we agree with a lot of leftists and even anti-capitalists on, to some extent, is the two-party system. There's really no other options, and an independent can't win in America, for example.
Yeah,
It's
even in
never happened.
Australia, we have I'll say objectively better system than you do. What we have is preferential voting. So say you really like an independent, but you prefer, say, Republicans to Democrats. So there's 3 parties: independent, Republican, Democrat. You can vote number 1, independent. But then when they lose, say they get the least votes, then all their votes get discarded, and they look at the number 2 on your list, and that vote goes to number 2. So you put number 2 Republican, and your vote goes to Republican then, and then you put number 3 Democrat, so that it's just
And that
which
that
allows
system's been talked about and proposed here, but of course the parties in charge of actually voting for that voting regulation don't want. It's not. It's not advantageous for them.
But even with that, we still have 2 very dominant parties, Labour and Liberal, which is, I'll say, pretty similar with your parties. I think Labour is a bit more left than your Democrats, but it's very similar.
Okay.
Regardless.
Well, maybe we'll come back to, because I think the how communism might take hold in America or globally is a deeper question. So maybe we'll circle back to that. But we had a few other like topics we wanted to get through with you too.
No problem.
Yeah. So first of all, you probably have to get your sources from somewhere, right? So I'm wondering which like news channels or news sources do you prefer more and trust more for news?
Yeah. Well, with like direct news, like immediately after an event happens, I really just look at anything, just look it up and go on whichever publisher makes it first. But with my more like deep political thoughts, I usually look to YouTube. There's this one channel which I've watched extensively over the last few years. His name is William Paul Cockshott. I think his YouTube channel is just Paul Cockshott. He's a Scottish professor. He's very deep communist, and he's posted a lot of videos on many topics, such as like physics, but a lot of economics, politics, and it's commented on like modern events as well, like the Russian-Ukrainian war. Apart from that, so there's him, and there's like a lot of other academic sort of people that I look to, which are more restrained from like the popular news sources, which I think are, they're more generated just to get clicks and views rather than actually give you information. So I have like a few like that, but generally it's just academic sources and whichever popular media outlet makes it first.
Okay. And we didn't actually. I don't think we asked you this earlier, but your family, like, what do they lean similar to you, or do you have differing opinions?
We have differing opinions. I'll say they're mostly apolitical, but
Okay.
they have obviously a few views in the Soviet Union. They live there, and I've asked them on it, and again they give me sort of a nuanced view of what it really was, which I think is
Mhm.
very important. But they're mostly apolitical, again, have a few views, maybe slightly left leaning, especially compared to America. I would say in
Mm.
Australia, people are more left leaning compared to America on average, but
Yeah.
not like me. But
Yeah.
my grandparents, on the other hand, two of them worked as teachers, and in the Soviet Union, to work as a teacher, you had to be a member of the Communist Party
Right.
as a part of the. So they were trained as communists. So two of them were. One of them, my Polish grandparent, she's a Polish Catholic and very, very anti-communist.
Mm.
Absolutely hated the whole system. She was very anti-communist, very religious, and again, in the Soviet Union, religion it wasn't banned, but it was frowned upon. That's sort of my family story.
Okay. Okay. Very
Huh.
interesting.
So, do you like, or what are your thoughts about like kids talking about politics like us?
Yeah. Well, look, it's important, especially at a certain point, once the kids mature enough, which I think is for. It doesn't happen at a certain age, it's different for everyone when someone gets, mature enough to be able to speak on issues properly. But I think politics is important and talking to children about politics is important as long as they understand why things happen. It's not just a matter of this is good, that's bad, there. It's, actually understanding why that works, why that doesn't work, why this might work, might not work, we don't know. It's a very nuanced subject and it requires a lot of nuance when teaching, especially to children.
Now, you got interested in, let's say, politics, economics pretty young.
Yeah.
Maybe because of your background, but what are your friends like?
Yeah, well, I'm definitely the furthest into politics out of anyone. When I got in, I was definitely alone. There was no one else who was 12 years old that was also like looking at the stuff I was looking. But as I've gone through my schooling years, other people have also sort of gone into it, and they
Mhm.
usually come to me sort of asking me stuff, and I tell them my views, and we sort of have a little because they usually develop their own views from the internet, where we have little talks. So there are now at school, there's probably 4 or 5 others or a few of them are my friends, 2 of them are just random people who are, I would say, interested in politics. Not necessarily communist or socialist by any means. Most of them are sort of don't have any coherent political views, I would say.
Mm.
But they are clearly interested and they like each time something happens, they, talk about it, or they talk to me about it. So now there are people like that. But when I first started, there wasn't.
Okay. Okay. Yeah, I imagine at 12,
Very young.
yeah, that's pretty young especially to be getting into because you had sent us a bit about some of your reading material, and it's
Reading material,
pretty
yeah.
dense. Like it's
So I
pretty
have
advanced and dense.
bookshelf, yeah, back there.
Yeah.
It is quite dense.
I mean, it was like
um,
Marx,
yeah,
Lenin, yeah,
it
John
is.
Locke, I think. So like you've
Yeah,
read some pretty
it is.
deep.
Yeah, the Marx and Lenin is definitely the hardest to read just because it was so long ago. Like the
Yeah.
writing's clearly outdated. But I've read lots of other stuff, which is also like academic. But yeah, so I've gone into a
Yeah.
fair bit of that over the years. Yeah,
Well, good
yeah,
good for you, but
yeah,
yes, it's dense at that age for sure.
yeah.
So,
What are some key points in either your current politics in Australia or politics here, possibly, that you were very passionate about?
Mhm. Uh, well, look, I'll say naturally as a socialist communist type, private property, it's like a key part of society, which
mhm,
people, they're born with. They have that idea that people can just buy whatever they want, and they just grow up and they live with that idea, not realizing that over our thousands of years as a society, it's changed a lot. Our laws around who can own what have been vastly different, from slavery, where you can own people, which is like very extreme, to
Yeah.
egalitarian societies where owning anything was banned. Like by egalitarian, I mean the primitive ones, the
mhm.
tribes thousands of years ago where owning anything was banned and everything was the same. But there's been a vast difference over society, and I think it's time to revise what we think you should be able to do again.
So private property. So the
So,
Yeah,
ability to own private property
yeah,
is a topic. Okay, that's a big and that's a deep one.
very,
Okay.
very big topic. Yeah, like apart from that, I'll say again democracy sort of one, which I was talking to you about. But
Mhm.
I think it's important for people to hold power. The key communist idea. What else? Like, I have general, like most leftists, they talk about, poverty and dignified right to live and free
Sure.
water and free housing. I have those ideas, but I think that it's like a more surface level, resting upon the whole idea of private property and how we manage things as a society. And
Yeah.
Okay.
so that's probably the big one, which is like uniquely sort of socialist and communist, and
Right.
those are the
So,
things.
okay, that's actually a good way to put it. Is so
Yeah,
the deeper issues are the ones that you're interested in,
yeah.
while surface level, however, they're massive isses, which is
Even though they're massive.
universal healthcare, universal
Yeah,
income,
yeah,
yeah, foreign
mhm,
conflicts, wars. I
yeah,
imagine Gaza and Ukraine,
mhm,
all like these
yeah,
types of things are
mhm,
what you would consider sort of
yeah.
maybe not
So
the
again,
core.
yeah, because again, they're very big issues, and that's what we're trying to solve. But
Hmm.
the communist outlook is that they're rested upon the bedrock of capitalism. Capitalism creates these issues through its
Mm.
contradictions, through the way it operates. And to solve those issues, you have to solve the core problem. And the reason why we can't solve those issues is because we haven't solved the core problem yet. So that's my view on it.
Okay.
Yeah.
Mm.
Okay. Well, do you mind if we unpack communism a little bit? This wasn't set up as a debate. However, like we want to
Yeah.
ask what I'd say are common critiques of
Yeah.
communism that I'm sure you're familiar with. So, if you look at history
Yeah.
and you do some queries, let's say through Google or a lot of means, you'll find that communism has, let's say, the highest death toll. It's had
Hmm.
very difficult times
Yeah.
implementing itself in the utopic format that Marx talked about, etc.
Hmm.
So, in terms of actual implementation, it's had a lot of historical challenges. So how do you how do you think about that?
Well, firstly, a key thing which I want people to realize with when they talk about death toll, because everyone always they spurt out numbers on the internet
Mm,
or wherever. They say 20 million here, 60 million there, 100
mhm,
million, whatever you want. Uh, the general numbers come there's a 20 million number which comes for the Soviet Union. It
right.
comes from the Black Book of Communism, which has been sort of rejected by academics because it goes for like the higher estimates, and also it counts a lot of things which you wouldn't really call deaths. It
Mhm.
counts Nazi soldier fatalities from the war, which again they were being invaded. I don't find a Nazi to be a victim of communism.
Mhm. You're talking
They
about
I
like
think
World War II?
World War Two, yeah,
Yeah, the Russians lost
um,
A lot of
a lot,
soldiers.
soldiers
a
in
lot of
World War II,
soldiers,
more
yeah,
than any other nation.
yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
I think some sources they count like the Soviet Union re-legalized abortion,
Mhm.
uh, and they count deaths from aborted babies as deaths of communism.
Oh, okay.
Which, again, like whether you're for or against abortion, I'm not sure whether you would call a fetus the same
Yeah. Those
one
numbers
to
aren't
one
typically
ratio as
included in
one.
any stats. Like
Yeah,
w
yeah,
yeah.
yeah. So there's a few sketchy numbers.
What about things like the Bolshevik Revolution and the famines?
Yeah. So, well, with the famines, you think of the Holodomor happening in Ukraine in the 20s, 30s under
Mm,
Stalin, which is with the collectivization, which I was talking about before.
mm,
But the death ranges, they go from 3 million to 7 million starved. And again, like it was mostly due to the collectivization which happened, which in one of the books I was reading, Farm to Factory, it's called, they heavily critique the collectivization.
mhm,
The guy actually says that Stalin did a very good job with industrializing the country, which he objectively
mhm.
did. The Soviet
Yeah.
Union had the fastest growth rate out of any country ever in the world, except Japan. Japan beat it, but considering that the Soviet Union was a much bigger country, like it was like a growth rate per the starting, how much
Yeah.
the industry was starting with.
Bigger
It's
country to
not
mobilize. Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. Anyway, but he does critique collectivization, which again I've said I'm not fully decided on, but it's important to know that the famine was from that. And it's also
Mhm,
important to remember that the Russian Empire, before being the USSR, had regular famines. They had a famine, I think, at the end of the 1800s, which killed a few million. A few
mhm,
30 years before that, it was just a symptom of pre-industrialized society. That whenever there's a bad harvest, there's a famine, few thousand, few million maybe people die, and you go on with
mhm,
your life.
mhm,
Only in the last 100 years or so we've had the privilege of having food all throughout our lives. And the Soviet Union gave its people that privilege by industrializing the nation that quickly.
mhm.
So that's with the Soviet Union. But the biggest death numbers come from China
Mao? Mhm.
Oh
under
wow.
Mao and the sparrows and all that. Uh,
Mhm.
the first number to come out was from Deng Xiaoping, who was later the leader of China, but he was a critique of Mao.
Mhm.
And he went to the countryside and he said that, like, by using his own estimations and calculations, he said 14 million people have died due to the policies. So it was
Right.
14 million, which again, I'm not sure if it's true or not, but it was something around that. But then later in this Black Book of Communism, which again, it sort of uses these very dodgy estimates, they
Mhm.
inflated that number to around 40 million. They just inflated it a fair amount. And that's the
Okay.
number they rolled with.
So
So, yeah,
yeah. So even if the numbers are inflated, like what about
yeah.
the fact that these societies haven't had longevity? Like they tend to crumble
Yeah.
and fail.
Well, they have crumbled. The Soviet Union and China in the 90s was all of one big event because
Mhm.
these communist societies, because they're sanctioned and embargoed by the capitalist bloc, they rely on each other for trade. So when the Soviet Union collapsed, all these small countries which relied on it for trade, they also collapsed. They had a big choice. Basically, all these countries had a choice: either go capitalist and accept IMF, demands and capitalist trade, or they can go in this really, really seclusive society where they just live by themselves. And one country did that, and that's North Korea. So
Mm.
before the Soviet collapse, North Korea was a very different country because it had ability to trade and it was
Mm.
much, much, much more developed. Now it's like the way it is because it just was the most stubborn one which chose to not go capitalist after the Soviet collapse. Anyway,
Mhm.
so yeah, there was a big collapse. The reasons for that I can go into, but they're quite lengthy.
Yeah.
What's important to remember is that when capitalist society was founded, because before the Enlightenment and capitalist ideals, we had feudalism and absolutism and all these different
Yeah.
more authoritarian regimes. Uh, the first sort of instance of capitalism in Europe. In America, you could say the USA sort of founded it first, and they
Mhm.
had a very good run. But in
Mhm.
Europe, the French, in 1788, they killed the king, established a republic based on what we call capitalist ideas, right? The
Right.
legal code which Napoleon established in France is still used there. They, said every person is sort of equal, but private property should exist. We are a capitalist society. And that's
Right.
why Marxists call the French Revolution a bourgeois revolution. It was a
Mhm.
revolution of the capitalists. They created that, and 30 years later, they were destroyed at Waterloo. And France was given back to a monarchy. They were given back a
Mhm.
monarchy, lost as a monarchy for a while, and then they've again had tumbles trying to become a republic. There's been a big struggle in Europe. In 1848, there was many revolutions all across Europe. You can look it up at revolutions of 1848 in Italy, Germany, even the UK, I think. Anyway, all for the Republic, they were all crushed, destroyed. So with changing political systems in across the world, it's a lengthy process. It doesn't happen overnight. And when it does happen, it's not immune to failure. It
Yeah.
often takes a few tries to get the right one. So I'd say that the collapse of communism isn't some, divine truth saying that communism is doomed to failure. Is just a process of history, something which can happen,
And
and it did happen. So
you mentioned that the onset of capitalism is one of the factors that may have disabled or handicapped communist countries. So does that suggest that we have to have a world communist like society to
that's what a
down?
lot of communist support is like.
It seems like a
Global
convenient. It
revolution.
seems like a convenient factor, though, don't you think? Like
As in,
why can't a communist, for example, trade with a capitalist country?
or because they sort of, well, they have, but it's a bit more nuanced. Again, like by I say they can't, I mean the Soviet bloc and the Western bloc in the Cold War because they had tensions with each other.
Yeah.
Before that, the Soviet Union, after it was created, after the Bolsheviks took power and won their war, the Western powers of Europe, firstly they invaded Russia in 1919, trying to support the whites, and then they lost. So British and French troops invaded, they lost, and then they stopped recognizing the Soviet Union, and they placed embargoes on them, so they couldn't trade
Hmm.
with them. And for a while, no country even recognized the Soviet Union.
Hmm.
In 1920s, I was just reading a book about this. The German foreign minister, because Germany was also very isolated at this time. They just lost the war, they lost their monarchy, their empire. They were looking for friends, they saw the Soviet Union also didn't have any friends, and they created this Treaty of Rapallo, which it was called, where they sort of recognized each other and they started trading, just general trade and also munitions, which is a bit sketchy under the Treaty of Versailles, which said that Germany can't rearm. But anyway, they did that. So it's not the Soviet countries can't trade, but it's just when there's two big blocks and they're diametrically opposed, as capitalism's very much against communism, they don't want to trade. Just like we don't really want to rely on Russia or China for trade when they're fighting us. It's just a thing which happens.
I like history, so
the boys.
Very.
That's my favorite subject, at least me. So
Well, yeah,
well, you've obviously read your history. That's pretty cool.
you like your books, and I like books, so I like that.
That's good to hear. That's very good to hear.
How about, so let's just say there's countries today, North Korea, you could say Cuba, Venezuela, like they're all in the midst of they've gone through some changes, but they all do struggle. And so what do you attribute that to?
Again, I'll say probably the embargoes and all that, but also it's important to recognize that it's hard for poor countries to get rich, and it's easy for rich countries to stay rich, right? Of the countries 150 years ago, which were very poor, are rich nowadays. There's probably only a handful. Korea comes to mind, Japan, China, Singapore is probably a big one.
Yeah.
But apart from that, basically all the countries 150 years ago which were poor have stayed poor. It's a hard struggle to become, to emancipate yourself as a third world country. So when, Cuba's always been one of the poor ones. They were oppressed by the Spanish and then the Americans. They had a dictator in the 50s. It's hard to get it to be good. And I think the Cubans have done a good job of that. They have now, I think, is very similar, even higher life expectancy than the USA. They have reasonable living standards, again, not as good as the rich countries. Historically, China has been very rich, but about 200 years ago, they were sort of mutilated in the process of colonization. It's called like the Century of Humiliation in China. And again, the communists took it, and now it's at the top again.
You wouldn't consider China a communist country today, right?
I wouldn't. Like, it's sort of a mixed economy. People like to say, oh, the victory of China is a victory of capitalism, not communism. But if we implemented the same policies China has in the West, a lot of guys would call it socialism. Even though it's not, I disagree. I would say it's not. But it's much more left-leaning than any Western society. I would say if there was a society which it was most similar to, it would be the British, when the Labour government had like a 20-year cement of dominance, and they had like a very big mixed economy where the state owned like a lot of industry, when they had like a lot of government subsidized services. That ended when Margaret Thatcher took into power in the UK. But it's very similar to what China has today. So no, it's not capitalist, but it's also very government guided.
This is kind of related. This is related to communism. But I'm just curious because we've actually had a few communists on lately.
Yeah.
So, because around Gen Z, they're starting to become more communist. So I'm curious, why do you think that like Gen Z is suddenly now like becoming more communist?
Yeah, well, I'd say it's not necessarily they're becoming more communist, but I think there is a bit more just political extremism and politics in general in society. Again, where sort of things are ramping up in the world. 30 years ago, it was pretty quiet. America was the victor. People said it was the end of history. Communism has failed. Capitalism will be like this. It'll be all good forever. But now, there's challenges. There's Russia. There's China. There's more far right extremists as well as far left. As for why they're becoming communists, I would say just society in general, the poverty in the world and all that cause people to become far left as well as far right as well. So there is growing.
It's interesting though, because the global standard of living is higher than it's ever been, right?
Partially that's true. We have like higher wealth inequality than the French did during their revolution, but back then they were actually impoverished, So yeah, we have had better growth, but I think this is a good thing, but it's also a bad thing. Humans are never satisfied. They always push for more. And it sort of made us this big triumphant civilization that's taken domination over everyone else. We have grown as a species a lot, but we're still not satisfied. And I think it's just part of the human condition. So
yeah. Do you think that human condition challenges some of the theory though of communism or particularly Marxist ideology?
I would say it actually fits in quite well. Marxism sort of analyzes history as like a struggle over material conditions. It's sort of it comes from the idea that to live, even nowadays, to live, we need to work, right? It has been that way the whole time.
Yeah,
Cavemen, they had to each day get up and make food by hunting so they can live.
sure.
Nowadays, we still need to do that. And
But we
the way
don't,
in which we
right?
work,
Yeah.
well, like, even though it might not seem that we do, we still do. Like, if everyone stopped working, nothing would happen. So, and the way in which we work and create the goods for ourselves, which we need, sort of influences how society works in general.
Yeah.
Whether you're being forced to work by a harsh slave owner who's whipping you, or whether you're coerced to work by monetary gain through a capitalist, but really the capitalist is exploiting you, which is what Marxists say happen in capitalist society.
Right.
It changes the dynamics and what goes on. It's hedged in this idea that people want better living standards. That the people in the oppressed class would, if they could, they would fight and they will take over and they will create a better life for themselves, which I think has happened over history. Whether those revolutions have succeeded or not, but they have happened, where oppressed people, slaves or peasants or nowadays workers have taken up arms and fought, to get better living standards.
Yeah.
So,
and so what's the goal, like, of, let's say, a communist that's living in America who has a very high living standard? Even homeless people have high living standards here. And so they don't really have economic hardship because the government will provide for them, right? General, like, food, welfare, etc. They think they're oppressed, but, like, are they really, if they have everything that they need?
right. Well, I'll say you can define oppression not by whether you have everything you need, right? Like, for example, kings back 500 years ago, they didn't have clean water ready at a minute's notice, but you wouldn't say they were oppressed. Actually, they were the oppressors. They were feeding on the labor of the peasants. I'll say that today we have come to a point where labor productivity is so high that even what we call high living standards is still being oppressed. We're still giving our labor to the capitalists, and you can calculate how much
You're talking about like
labor.
surplus. You're talking about like
Surplus
surplus
value.
labor.
Yeah, surplus labor, which you're giving.
So you mentioned earlier that people, like, inherently want to do better and do more.
Yeah.
And so, like, let's just say somebody who invents something really cool. This is, I think, a challenge with communism. I'm curious, like, how you think about this. But people that work harder and innovate more and take more risks and delay gratification further are going to want more out of society than somebody who sits in their mom's basement and plays Fortnite all day. So, like, how do you like remedy that situation?
I envision a society which levies a base tax rate, right? And this is a tax which pays for all the public services which the government gives. And this tax rate requires everyone in society who can work, right? Like, maybe disabled people or whoever can be exempt from this, retired. But every able-bodied person has to work a certain number of hours per year. And if they just want to work that and plus a little bit extra to buy food just for the bare minimum, they can do that. If they want to work more, they can, and they'll get extra money, which they can buy to use to buy extra things in exchange for working more for society, right? You give in more, you get more. As long as the condition is that they don't accumulate so much wealth that they can buy society as a whole, right? If they buy the factory where all the other workers work at, then they can start oppressing their own workers, right? Or if they save up so much money, they can buy all the houses in their street and kick everyone else out and offer them back in as tenants and oppress them through rent, then that shouldn't be allowed, right? The way I can imagine this working is sort of like maybe a deadline on when you have to spend your money so that you can't accumulate so much wealth that you can oppress other people, right? But I do believe if people work more, they should get more.
But to a limit, but only to a limit. And who decides the limit?
Well, I believe society as a collective should, and they'll be responsible with that again because everyone wants to secure each other's needs.
Won't then society just keep the limit really low because they don't want people to get, like, ahead of them?
But the people in society are the people.
Yeah, like, how would they do? Like, would they vote? They would vote for this, or?
I suppose so. Like, again, it's not like a proper sort of coherent idea yet, but voting or sortition, it would have to be a committee of many, many thousands of people which we can now do due to the internet and stuff, which have a representative view of society as a whole.
It'd be a lot
That's
of
how I
work.
feel about the year. Sorry?
Like that would be like a lot of work. A poll that
It
says
would
like
be.
John has worked 5 extra
Yeah.
hours. Should he get $10 more? Like, and
Yeah.
then just like going through
Well,
that constantly. That
it's
seems like it's highly unnecessary.
it definitely used to be unnecessary and it was very hard to do. In the Soviet Union, they had like a committee, not for this sort of stuff, but for like government planning, where to invest your resources, which industries should you grow and allocate funds to. It was called Gosplan. They had around 40,000 people working for them. All of them were just like accountants, sort of, to calculate, crunch the numbers. But nowadays, it's much easier through computer algorithms and stuff. In fact, the YouTube channel guy, he wrote a book in the 90s showing that in the 90s, right, when computers were very basic, that you could plan an economy and do all this stuff with a state with like an investment of like 10 million or so. Nowadays, you could probably do it with like a good PC, right? In the 1800s, there was a British industrialist called Robert Owen. He owned this factory, but he was like a socialist, right? Even though he was an oppressor, he had the socialist ideas in him. And he decided, well, what if I pay my workers not money, but labor tokens? So for each hour you work, you get 1 hour payment, right? Which represents 1 hour of your work. And with that, you could buy 1 hour of someone else's work, right? So which is the whole communist idea, right? Say your computer takes 10 hours to make, you work for 10 hours, you get 10 labor tokens, and you can buy that computer, because that computer, from the scraps, which it was iron alloy and all that, and copper in society, we have now taken all that labor and created an actual computer, which took 10 hours. So with 10 hours of your work, you can buy that. And he did that, and like it worked in his little factory for quite some time. And he did that in the 1800s, before any technology. So now with credit cards and digital transactions, I think it's definitely feasible. And I'll say the chaotic capitalist system actually creates oftentimes more hardship on planning than communism does.
How about, okay, so I mean, there's tons of questions I could ask. We don't have enough time for, but a couple other, like, say, common critiques.
Yeah.
One is
Mm.
communist revolutions or countries seem to be very ripe, and even by Marx's own, I think, outline, they tend to go through an authoritarian rule before they can be turned over to the proletariat, right? So how does one avoid this? Once control gets taken place, it's hard to give it back, right? And we saw this in many of these regimes over time. So how does one avoid that in a
Right.
communist development?
Well, I'm not sure if avoiding it is necessary. The Soviet Union sort of tried to start implementing communism, but they couldn't, because there's the USA and their huge military right next door. Having to completely match the USA in military spending and fight proxy wars, they never really could. So I think it's an interesting question, and how it's achieved, it's something which is worthy to figure out. But
Yeah.
I can't use any historical examples, because we've never even reached the stage where I think it's necessary to abolish the state.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Fair enough. Another
Yeah.
common critique I see is that people in their human nature obviously want to get the best out of life, right? They want to earn the most, have the best place, and particularly if they work hard. And they want to do that for the least amount of effort, typically, right? Like you want to maximize your output, minimizing your input, let's just say.
Yeah.
But in a communist society, you have a ceiling on your output. And so then what that does in theory is it drives your input or your work or your effort asymptotically to zero, right? And so that level will just keep lowering down. And this is theory, but it does make a lot of sense to me just based on human nature. How do you think about that?
Well, like with the whole human nature thing, people, they do want the best. And I'll say that that's something which supports communism, right? In capitalist society, there's a system where 99% of the people have around half their labor taken away by the capitalist group, and they want to change that, right? They want to, make it so they get their best. And when the 99% revolts, takes over, that's what happens. That's what communism is. With the ceiling, are you referencing like what I was talking about before, like with the deadline on payments? or what sort
Yeah, I
of
mean that
feeling
that or that theory I think
viewing?
is generally
Yeah,
common in a communist society where
yeah,
you have a maximum or you have a cap on the things that you can
pretty
have,
much.
own, and wealth that you
Right.
can have,
Yeah, yeah.
right?
Well, look, yeah, I'll say like there should again. It's sort of there's a big qualitative, not quantitative divide. I think if you want to have, I don't know, 50 million Legos in your house, you should be able to do that. But you can't
Mhm.
own just one factory because that factory allows you to exploit other people. Whereas the Lego,
Mm.
who's gonna like doesn't matter. If you want to work extra hours to get extra toys or whatever, or I don't know, whatever hobby you have, you should be
Or a
able to
nicer
do that.
home, maybe a nicer home.
Yeah. Nice at home, yeah. If you want to do that, I think that should be okay, as long as it's not basing yourself on exploitation of others, right? But the only other like ceiling or sort of like disincentive to working will be taxation, which is why I'm thinking a flat base. In capitalist society, we have progressive taxation, right? The more you earn, the more you pay in tax, which is
Yep.
meant to sort of lessen
Equalize things.
balance
Mhm.
the bad things in capitalism, right? It's a
Right.
remedy to what I think is a bad system.
Mhm.
But in my view, you should just have a base tax rate where you contribute to society, and then above that, you can spend as much as you want, earn as much as you want, and do that. With
Mhm.
like innovation or like technological progress, you invent something, you get patents. When you create something, you can still give it out to society and retain a bit of the profit,
Yeah.
right? Because if you didn't have that, as soon as you would invent something, you would just keep it secret. So only you can use it.
Right.
No one else in society can use it. And that's damaging
Right.
to society, right? If
Yeah.
James Watt, who invented the steam engine, decides to just keep it secret in his own lab and not show it to the rest of the world, we would still be digging in dirt agriculturally, right?
Right.
So, but how much should we reward the people that invent things?
Mm.
Some people say we should reward them a lot and give them a lot of stuff. But the thing is that who invented it, right? Like James Watt, he came up with the idea for the war engine, right? Which started the
Mhm.
Industrial Revolution. But before that, there was the newcomer engine, right? Which was like less efficient. So only just increased the efficiency,
Right.
right? But say we decide to pay him as much money that he increased the efficiency by, right? So the first one was like, say it will give you $10 for each use, right? That's like a
Yeah.
weird way to call a steam engine. This one gives you 15. So for
Yeah.
each time you use it, you give him $5. Then
Right.
society doesn't get any benefit out of it because each bit of surplus we create with the machine, we give away to this one guy as he becomes increasingly wealthy.
Yeah.
And especially when you consider that the reason why he created the steam engine was not just his own brilliant mind, but was all the mathematics and the physics and all the work of all his predecessors, to create those other machines and to create those minds where he could create the tools for his own machine. Inventions are attributed to society, really, not individual people. Even though one guy does the eureka moment and invents it, that
Mhm.
invention is based on the collective effort of our society over thousands of years. So I think the benefit should go to society, right? We should have like researchers and people who innovate, but the things they create, they'll get paid for it, but not excess so that they can amass wealth just themselves off the benefit of the rest of society. No, we should use those inventions to better the entirety of society. And that's the best way to operate things, I believe.
Yeah. Yeah,
But
yeah.
it's
I
an interesting
understand.
question as well.
I think I understand that argument. However, a
Yeah,
counter argument might be, well, that person had the ingenuity and the know-how to take
yeah,
this idea and make it much better. And why
mhm,
not give them more resources so they can do the same to some other industry and some
right.
other industry? Like Elon Musk
Well,
is a great example that he's
mhm,
developed things that nobody else has. And you could say, well, he stole the
right.
ideas or he, robbed
Mhm,
people's labor. But without him having that capability, we wouldn't have
right.
reusable rockets. We wouldn't have electric cars that are like basically the
Mhm,
standard now. And so, like,
right.
there is a counter argument there too,
The reason
recognized.
why Elon Musk has all these industries and has implemented all this stuff is because he has the capital to do it, right? He has the
Mhm.
funding himself from his other businesses, which generated profit to him, right? He's the richest guy on the planet.
He could just be sitting
Right?
in Monaco on a huge yacht, but he's actually continuing to develop
Yeah,
stuff, right?
he is. But I believe that he's probably not the smartest guy on the planet. There's better geniuses than him who have less
Mm.
funding. And I believe, capitalism misallocates that funding. Again, his sort of like, yeah, it's good on him for inventing stuff.
Mm.
It's better than sitting at home doing nothing. If the state had full control over resources, we could properly allocate funding to the actual real geniuses and the real because again, coming back to my first idea, things aren't invented by just one person. Oftentimes, it's very funny to look at history because it's like, say, planes, right? When invented, and then a sudden moment, everyone can start flying. Right? The Wright brothers did it first, but like
Mhm.
weeks after that, there was all these other flights as well, which happened, which you don't hear about, right?
Right.
Suddenly, the technology happened, the change happened, where geniuses, right? Not everyone could still, even after that happened, not everyone could fly a plane, but there
Yeah.
was like a group. It wasn't just one. There was like a good group of people who could now do it and fly. Same
Right.
thing with
Right.
steam engines, with any invention ever. So it's not just this one person. We should have a committee where there's people who can do research and they get generous funding to do the research and a reasonable paycheck to live their life
Yeah.
to benefit society, I believe.
Yeah. What is also tricky is like who decides all of these things in a
Yeah.
communist society where it's supposedly stateless, right? And
Yeah.
so then who decides?
Well,
Mm.
again, yeah, as a mixed. One of my first ideas, which I told you guys, was sortition, right, where people are randomly
Mhm.
selected. That works for some things, right?
Yeah.
Coming up with like, for example, the retirement age, right? You get a lot of people
Yeah.
together. They all decide we should allocate it to this, so then the state has more funding, or no, we should make it lower, so then people have more time at home. But then eventually they come with a decision which represents what society thinks. Other things like military generals, you don't want them to be randomly selected from the public. They need to be,
Yeah.
skilled, trained in military strategy, right? So they should be probably not even elected. They should be selected, right? Which is
Mhm.
what we have now. There probably are some middle of the road positions where you want them to somewhat represent the public, but they still need to have some skills, right?
Mhm.
We have a mix in our society, right? We have sortition for jury duty, we have
Mhm.
election for politics, and we have selection for, again, like generals and ministers and all that. I think should be a bit of an expansion for the sortition level because they'll increase actual democracy and representation.
Yeah.
But there still should be like selection of real people.
Yeah. One of the
Yes.
things that I would say is interesting about communism is
Mhm.
less government, less
Yeah.
bureaucracy, less
Mhm.
administration.
Yeah.
However, all these things still do need to happen.
Mhm.
And
Yeah.
and I think of also communism as less corruption, but in
Mhm.
reality, it's still it's still
It has.
subject to
Mhm.
corruption, right?
It has had corruption and it has had like black markets and stuff as well, right? In Latvia, if you wanted to get like a pair of jeans, which the government didn't have because, well, they'll get them, but then they'll get sold out immediately, right? And they'll just be empty. But you'll go to like a sketchy vendor, but they're having like workarounds, in modern society. Nowadays, I think ideally communist society will be lacking of money. And I know a lot of people like money because to them it represents freedom. But
Yeah.
I think ultimately, when the whole of society is ran by people, there's no like who are you hiding from, right? Like the government and the state, we're all your friends because we are
Mhm.
you. Online transactions, and you can't have a black market.
Now,
So
obviously, people
yeah,
that have, let's say, assets, wealth, or okay, myself, like I'm not a
Mhm.
rich guy. However,
Yeah,
I've developed assets. I have a home. I
Mhm.
worked hard and I got all this stuff. And
Yeah,
so, in this, let's say, communist shift into our society, it would almost certainly require a revolution, in my
Mhm.
opinion, because people aren't going to want to give up what they have or what they've
Yeah,
earned or what, let's say,
yeah,
earned, but what they've attained.
and yeah,
And
yeah.
so, it's not gonna be easy, right?
Mhm. Yeah, it's not, but it's something which I think should happen. Yeah,
Mm,
should be redistributed, and still, because of the amount of wealth as a society we have, everyone will be given a
yeah.
reasonable amount. But yeah, like things might have to be taken. My great grandmother, she had it was either great grandmother or great great grandmother, but she had four husbands. All of them just died randomly. She ended up
Wow.
inheriting like four or five houses,
Oh,
like great big estates. And then the Bolsheviks came and like took them, except one, which she lived on. It was something which happened, but then those houses went to peasants who had never living by themselves ever in their
yeah.
lives. So it's not like sometimes it happens randomly. Sometimes you work for it and you earn it, but in the creation of a better society, I think it's something which has to happen, essentially. Yeah.
We could probably talk to you for
Yeah.
hours. I love
We
how
can.
much knowledge you have on history
Yeah.
and on these topics. So,
Mhm.
like I said, we could probably go on for hours. This is clearly catching steam for whatever reason
Mhm.
with the
Yeah.
younger generation. We talked a little bit about that, but it's definitely interesting. And so we're trying to learn more about what's propelling that in the minds of
Mhm.
young people. these days and trying to understand that a little bit more deeply. The boys are obviously absorbing a lot of this, but it's a deep, dense topic, and so hence I'm a little bit more involved. But why don't we maybe wrap this up? Maybe there's a follow-up that we can do at some point
Yeah,
too.
maybe that's what I was thinking. Yeah.
A couple of final things. What is some advice? You have gotten very involved in
Mhm.
politics, history, and even political theory. What's advice that you have for young people that are out there, like, living their lives?
Well, I think I'll say advice is if it doesn't properly affect you, right? If it's not directly a foot on your head, which is oppressing you, which you have to change, right? Which you generally, if it is like that, you'll feel passionate feelings about it, like
Mhm.
how Palestinians feel about, their occupation. But if you're just observing it from an outsider perspective, and it doesn't really matter, like, yeah, maybe this policy would increase your food by a little bit, this one won't, but it doesn't really matter. Try and look at both sides and understand why both sides have their views and understand how they developed, and not just get into like a mindset of these guys are evil, they're bad, these guys are good, right? I try and develop, even with like Nazis or Hitler, especially with Nazis and Hitler. Actually, I'm reading a book about it right now. But why that developed in Germany at that time, like where those ideas came from, why it happened, right? And that will give you like a better, I think, understanding of society and just of anything in general, right? If you understand why things happen, you can do whatever you want. If there's a Nazi at your front door with a gun trying to kill you, it's a bit hard to do that. It's a bit hard to look at him and understand where he's coming from. But if
Right.
you're sitting from a privileged position, in my room, in my chair, where the Nazi invasions happened 80 years ago, try and look at it and figure out why things happen is like the best. Like,
Yeah.
try and go as deep as you can, essentially.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, very interesting. And we appreciate you coming on and joining us all the way from Australia. So it's your
Yeah.
morning, it's our
It is
afternoon.
my one.
And
It
so
is. Yep.
it's been super cool to have you on.
Yeah. Thank you.
I've been absorbing this.
Have
You've
you-
probably been the most knowledgeable person that we've actually talked to that's like read
That's-
a lot of the
that's-
books and like
Mhm.
understands it, I'd say, pretty well. So it's
So,
pretty interesting.
I mean, it's pretty awesome.
Thank
So,
you.
Yeah.
Well, I'm
Well,
glad to give you a little perspective on how I see things. And yeah.
why don't we wrap up the podcast? We wish you the best of luck, and let's definitely stay in touch because I want to see
Yeah. I
how,
will.
where you go
Yeah.
from here.
Stay in touch.
All right.
All
Well,
right.
with that,
Thank you.
thank
See
you.
Thank you.